Hello, folks. We're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
What is the evidence that it has a preventative effect?
Here we go, you ready? Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. Vaccine or no vaccine, we're back.
It's Monday, June 15th, 2020, and we do warmly welcome you to the 13th episode of the American Chronicle, seeking once again to examine detail and possible political trajectory athwart a tide of news-grazed headlines. Tonight, we ride the waves of air in search of clarity on the US military, the value or lack thereof in electoral polling, and on Trump's fatally flawed desire to consider Confederate generals symbols of a great and victorious American history. With much to get through as ever then, here is our interview. This week saw Trump address graduating cadets at West Point in a socially distanced fashion, of course. Your continuing thoughts from last week on Trump's desire to be viewed as a great military figure. You mentioned his maybe having watched Patton too many times in his life last time. And in light of health issues that were raised by his West Point appearance and performance, your contextual thoughts on the concept of the health of a president and the concept of fitness for office, please.
Well, this week we saw President Trump deliver his commencement speech at the US Military Academy at West Point. This, of course, is a significant address for any president to give, and every year they are covered and dissected by the American media. This year, all the more so for a variety of reasons. Of course, Donald Trump himself had never served in the United States military, and this was also a commencement address, which was happening after commencement addresses across the country had been cancelled. Most graduating seniors this year simply did not have a commencement address. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump insisted that this one took place. What was remarkable about his speech, quite frankly, however, was the delivery of it. I'm sure we could spend some time considering what he actually said, but there's also concerns about how he said it. The president appeared to be very hesitant. He was delivering this from a teleprompter, so it wasn't as though he was having to ad-lib this, and yet he appeared to be having real trouble reading from the teleprompter. His delivery was stilted at best, hesitant at places, and outright stumbling on many occasions. There was also the small matter of the fact that he appeared to be struggling to hold a glass of water. This is not the image of a fit and healthy and robust president that Donald Trump wants to convey to the world. And I was reminded of the fact that, of course, he was very quick to attack Hillary Clinton when she stumbled and appeared to collapse from heat exhaustion in September 2016, in the last days and weeks of that campaign, suggesting that she wasn't going to be fit to serve as president. Well, here we are now, not quite 4 years to the day, but not far off from that occasion. Hillary Clinton, of course, is fit and well, and we are now talking about Donald Trump's fitness for office, above and beyond any questions about his political fitness for office. Rumors abound here in the United States, for example, that he may have suffered a stroke earlier in the year. There are questions being asked about the recent medical that he had conducted and the results thereof. So there are many questions, I think, being asked about Donald Trump, which are compounded, of course, by the video imagery of him leaving the stage by a slope, and again, doing so with very uncertain steps.
Indeed. Not purporting to be medical experts in this regard, then I'll pick up on the political fitness point there. CNN this week released a poll that put Biden 14 points ahead of the sitting president. We then saw Trump demand that said poll be removed from the airwaves, as it were, in the manner of a cease and desist. Your analysis of that moment, please, and continuing that comparative study you set up there with this moment in time in 2016.
So, all presidents, I think, are concerned by any polls that show them to be not leading. Every president wants to see themselves out in the lead. But it's remarkable, I think, that Donald Trump would demand, quite frankly, that CNN apologize for polls that seem to disagree with his own thinking, effectively. And just to fill in the details with regard to that, CNN put a poll out on Monday that showed the president trailing Joe Biden by some 14 points. It's about 55% to 41%. Right. And the president's approval ratings at 38%, which is really, really poor, it must be said. And for most presidents, you'd say that would be catastrophic heading into a campaign. The president has sought to get that reversed on the basis that he has hired a group of Republican pollsters, McLaughlin and Associates, to analyze these surveys. And they are obviously trying to tell him, oh, well, yes, of course, they'll be fine, and suggesting that the CNN results are flawed in some way, shape or form. But of course, what you find is that every polling company has their own ways of conducting polls, which are always done, it must be said, to favor one side or the other, which means that we must always take polls with a degree of cynicism, I think. And again, you asked me about how this relates back to 2016. Well, we all know what the outcome of that election was. Donald Trump won. And yet, seemingly every poll that was conducted up to Election Day suggested that that simply wouldn't happen, no matter how much those polls tightened in the last week or two of the campaign after the decision by James Comey to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server. So the politics of political polling are such that every side, I think, puts more weight on their own polls, goes to great lengths to try to pour cold water upon their opponent's polls, but it is remarkable and unprecedented for an American president to try to get a major news network to apologize for a poll which shows him lagging as this one does.
I'm with you on the polling point there for sure. All too often we see polls on a nation's independence, for example, claiming huge percentages in support when you find eventually that said poll was taken only of 100 members of that nation's independence party. Within the world of presidential election polling, the competition of that, as it were, what's the value of polling figures to either side? Is it just psychological attacks on resolve or something more?
I believe there is a concept with regard to polling which suggests that people like to be with winners. And Donald Trump, I believe, buys into this totally. He does not want to be seen as the underdog in any way, shape or form. Some politicians who would look at these figures and think, Mikey, I'm behind, would take great succor from it and say, right, I'm behind, but I'm not going to lose. I'm going to use this as a wake-up call to get the people out. And you could go back, for example, to Harry Truman in the famous election of 1948, when he won election for the first time in his own right, having succeeded to the presidency after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Famous headlines that election suggested that he would lose in the general election to Dewey. And of course, that wasn't the case. And yet every election poll suggested that Harry Truman was doomed to be an accidental president, and instead of which he ended up presiding over the nation until he handed over to Dwight D. Eisenhower in January 1953. Donald Trump, however, does not fit that caricature of the underdog. He likes to talked very much about how he's a winner. He likes winners. He doesn't like losers. He doesn't want to be seen as someone who is falling behind in any way, shape, or form. And yet his opinion polls have regularly failed to kick into the majority, if you will, and be seen to be a popular president. I was reminded early today that Ronald Reagan had an opinion poll approval rating in the mid-60s when he left the office. Donald Trump could only dream of having an opinion rating, quite frankly, in the 50s. He routinely struggles to get into the high 40s. Well, if you look at historic re-election campaigns, you really do need to be in the high 40s at the absolute minimum if you're looking to gain a second term in the White House. And so from a historic point of view, certainly Donald Trump does not appear to be well placed at this point. However, this is Donald Trump. These are strange times. And the left, quite frankly, rather than coalescing, as you might imagine they would, around a well-placed, centrist, moderate candidate in the form of Joe Biden, who probably has as good a chance of beating Donald Trump as anybody, seem to be more interested in eating their own, quite frankly, and in doing the good work which has been done, I think, by Joe Biden over the course of the last 5 or 6 months.
I'll come back to Trump's sense of residual self-image later, but expanding upon the political competition there, we've been ever faithful and kept a watchful eye on the Biden vice presidential pick throughout this season of the American Chronicle. And we saw this week that a former Orlando police chief, Val Demings, is being considered, possibly to appeal in part to the law and order desiring portion of centrist Democrats. So the significance and tensions in your analysis therein, please.
We have, as you rightly point out, routinely discussed who it is that might well become the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidates. Joe Biden has helped us with this to a certain extent. He very early on suggested that he would only choose a woman candidate. I've mentioned several times over the last couple of weeks my own belief that he was going to choose a woman of color for his vice presidential choice. And sure enough, the shortlist has emerged over the past week of several candidates who it's believed are being vetted for Joe Biden's VP choice. And of that list, only one, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, is a white woman. They include, for example, Kamala Harris from California. They include, for example, Dr. Rice, who was the former National Security Advisor to Barack Obama. They include New Mexico Governor Michelle Grisham, who is a Latina. It also includes several other individuals, and you rightly mentioned Congresswoman Val Demings from Florida, as well as Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. The challenge here, though, is that what is the fundamental requirement of a vice president above and beyond helping a candidate become president? That requirement is an ability to become president in a moment's notice should the unthinkable happen to their boss. And in this election, that is something which I think far too little attention is being paid to. Joe Biden is in his late 70s at this point in time and would become America's oldest elected president if he were to prevail. His health has to be a question which is being addressed, and his ability to survive a 4-year term in office therefore has to be addressed. And if that is a question which is being raised, the ability and the suitability and the qualification of his vice president becomes all the more important. And one of the great challenges, I think, which is facing not only Joe Biden, but other moderate centrist Democrats heading into the election in November, is the extent to which what might be viewed as a more radical left within the Democratic Party are more eager, it appears, to be ideologically pure than they are to defeat Donald Trump and to secure power, from whence, of course, they would be in a position to instigate the sort of change that they wish. But to do that, of course, they have to prevail. And I fear that a great deal of what it is that the more left of centre Democrats are looking to do in this election cycle could very well undermine Joe Biden's very real possibility of defeating the president in November.
Of the vice presidential picks that we've covered thus far on the show, from Gretchen Whitmer to Val Demings, who has the most political experience and greatest skill set in order to serve with Biden and, should the need arise, take his place in the long run?
One of the great challenges which the Democratic Party is going to have to get around between now and the end of July, at which point Joe Biden has promised that he will make his vice presidential selection, is recognizing the fundamental truth that the American presidency is won from the center. It is not won from the extremes. You have to win the center ground of American politics if you're going to become president of the United States. And any attempt by Joe Biden to attempt to placate what must be seen, I think, as the far left of the Democratic Party will merely play into Donald Trump's hands. He's already gearing up to make this election about law and order. And if he can drive a wedge between middle America and the extremes of the country geographically and politically, then he will win a second term in office. He will do that by portraying the Democratic Party as being not only weak on law and order, but criminally weak on law and order. And he will do that by pointing to events which are occurring around the country, places like Minnesota, for example, which have now voted to defund the police, looking at politicians such as AOC out of New York, for example, looking at individuals associated with the Black Lives Matter who the president will accuse of looking to undermine American law and order, looking to undermine what he will refer to as American values. He will look at the selection process by which Joe Biden decides who it is that he will announce as his vice president, and will be able to make a point that these individuals have been chosen not on their ability to serve as president, but to placate a voting bloc within the Democratic Party that Joe Biden believes he needs to win the presidency. The single most qualified and viable candidate, I think, on the list at this point would probably be Senator Kamala Harris out of California for a variety of reasons. She has a degree of tenure in office in the Senate. She has stature within the Democratic Party. She has a relationship with Joe Biden that certainly appears to be as amiable as he has with anybody who was a former candidate this time round. She's from California. It would reinforce the vote in California. We have discussed previously on this podcast the possibility, quite frankly, that he's going to carry California anyway. But certainly the idea of putting a black female candidate from the United States Senate on the ticket would, I think, to many people, be a bold statement of direction by Joe Biden. The great challenge again, however, which I return to, is if the more radical left view Kamala Harris as somehow not being progressive enough, they could be responsible in part, and I stress in part, for the second election cycle running for denying a Democratic candidate the presidency and granting Donald Trump a second term in office.
You mentioned there that US elections are won from the center, and I recall last week you codifying that, as it were, in terms of a middle 6% that Democrats and Republicans fight for. to what extent is there value in the more radical left's position to pull the Democrat Party their way, given the perception that that is exactly what Trump did to Republicans in the opposite direction in his 2016 electoral victory, and may seek to do so again amongst the body politic come November?
Well, there's no doubt that Donald Trump led a unique course to the presidency. I remember when you and I watched those results on election night. He had to thread a unique needle to secure the presidency, which nobody, quite frankly, at the start of election night thought possible. What I think became apparent throughout the evening, and indeed was perhaps apparent in the last days of the campaign, was that Republicans who had stated categorically that they would not vote for Donald Trump for president held their noses and did so. These were shy Republicans, if you will, in many ways not dissimilar from that British concept of the shy conservative who isn't going to tell a pollster that of their true voting intents, which of course therefore adds further fuel to the conversation that we were having earlier on this program about the veracity of polling. If one party in particular has no indication of being honest with the pollster, then it's perhaps fair to conclude that the polls are inaccurate on a regular basis. Well, what you clearly saw and see with Donald Trump is that if his popularity ratings were accurately reflected in a poll, he wouldn't have a prayer come November, because his polling figures have rarely leapt for very long above 35% or so. And yet within the Republican Party, its own internal pollings, which the president is very happy to trot out, suggest that he has an internal party rating of 90 or so percent. Now, neither of those two polling figures can be accurate, in my opinion. If he only had 35% approval rating around the country, quite frankly, his Republican colleagues in the Senate in particular would have deserted him long ago. And he would not be able to have this sort of fear factor that controls so many of his party colleagues. Neither can he truly have, in my opinion, an internal party approval rating of 90 odd percent, because this is not Saddam's Iraq, it is not Putin's Russia, where such figures would routinely be touted by a despot.
Indeed.
The United States is many things, but it is not quite at that point just yet.
Just yet.
Not just yet, absolutely. We do therefore have a quandary, which is this: what is Donald Trump's true approval rating? And all I can say is that we will only know that for certain come election night in November. Donald Trump only needs to win one election poll, and that is in November, just as he only needed to win one in 2016. And win it he did, remarkably so, but credibly so and legitimately so. Remarkably, we've heard Donald Trump say this week that if he loses the election in November, he will walk away quite peacefully, which is the first time we have heard him say that. The first time, frankly, we've heard him ever say that he would accept defeat in a poll, because 4 years ago, you will remember, he refused to answer a straight question in one of the debates about whether he would accept defeat in one of the polls, which I always thought was one of the most dangerous things he had ever said, because it brought into question the very veracity of the American democratic process. So, the polls are going to be telling. They are not looking good for Donald Trump at this point, but 4 years ago taught us that we should never count this candidate out. The state of the economy, the state of the unemployment in this country, the state of the American body politic, quite frankly, is such that you would look at this under any other circumstances and suspect that this is going to be like 1932 all over again, with Donald Trump becoming the latter-day Herbert Hoover. I'm not suggesting for the moment, by the way, that Joe Biden is likely to become an FDR figure, but certainly it does not look good from a polling point of view for the president. But as we've learnt many times, it's far too early to count him out.
Returning now to the sitting president and his efforts to look good, Trump and the military. Last week we referenced and analysed the criticisms levelled at the president by Generals Mattis, Kelly and Powell, a group of generals with whom Trump has seemingly found no cause for dispute this week, however, are the 10 Confederate generals after whom US Army bases are named. Generals who are believed to have run the Ku Klux Klan at various points. Generals who enthused about the dissolution of the Union in favour of a Southern slavocracy, among other such luminaries. The language from the Trump administration suggests such generals reflect a great and victorious American history. I subserve to your far greater knowledge in such matters here, James, as ever, but the last time I checked, the Confederacy were on the losing side of that great American history. Your thoughts, please.
The relationship between Donald Trump and the United States military is a very strange one, quite frankly. And I think that because of the grave crises that the nation currently finds itself in, these events are overshadowing the very, very grave question about the relationship between the American commander-in-chief and his military advisors, not only in uniform but also civilian. And that has been borne out, I think, by, for example, the General with Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, who has said that it was a mistake for him to have appeared with the president in recent events, certainly with regard to the walk out of the White House. It also is evident with regard to the relationship that the Confederacy still maintains within this country. The symbol of the Confederacy, the Stars and Bars flag, which many will be familiar with. For example, I remember as a child watching the Dukes of Hazzard, perhaps not being fully aware of the significance of the fact that the car that the Duke brothers used to tear around the countryside in was named the General Lee. That on the top of the car was painted the flag of the Confederacy. We have now reached a point in the United States history where, despite the statements of the American president that you rightly refer to, his United States military have now decided to ban all images of the Confederate flag from its bases. So it's no longer going to be permitted to bring not only flags onto bases, but also any imagery carrying the flags. Now, this is significant because, of course, many of the bases which we are talking about are in the South. And the South is in many ways the bastion of the American military. A vast proportion of America's serving men and women come from states which would have been in the Confederacy. They are south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it is a huge recruiting location for the American military. The romantic image of the American Confederacy as a group of rebels, effectively, continues to permeate American society. If you go to NASCAR meetings, for example, and again, many of these are based in the South, you will regularly see imagery of the Confederate flag. NASCAR has now suggested that they are going to prohibit the flying of the flag. This is the same week we have now seen the president say that he will no longer watch American soccer games or NFL games now that their players have been permitted to take the knee during the national anthem. So we are seeing a remarkable schism emerging between the past, the present, and the future, between an American president and his military. And this, of course, has great ramifications for the country, because this has long been one nation divided over a variety of issues, not least of which is race, issues to do with slavery, and the original sin thereof within the American Constitution. The founders attempted to sweep this issue under the carpet. They did so until the 1860s, when that issue could no longer be avoided. The Civil War was believed to have been, at least in part, an attempt to rectify that issue. It simply didn't work. The Reconstruction era that followed was a poor attempt to do so, and indeed it was over 100 years later when President Kennedy announced from the Oval Office that the heirs, the grandchildren of Abraham Lincoln, were still not free, and that his administration would attempt to do something about that by putting forward the Civil Rights Act. Kennedy, of course, did not live to see that enacted, and indeed, in many ways, it was his assassination that permitted Southern Democrats to get behind their new Southern president, Lyndon Johnson, in his effort to enact that piece of legislation. And yet here we are now, over 50 years on from those days of the civil rights movement, and we are still seeing great debate within this country over the direction of its attempts or not to further the rights of African American citizens. And it seems to be a national debate that this president simply does not want to get engaged in.
That's it for this week's American Chronicle. My thanks to James, as ever, and to Chris Warner for our theme music. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Until next Monday, good luck, and ever onward to you all.